The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my phone screen, watching it light up with my stepmother's name. Patricia never called me. In the 8 years since she'd married my father, our conversations could be counted on one hand, each one brief and cold as winter rain. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Jasmine. Her voice was steady, almost businesslike. Your father passed away this morning. Heart attack. It was quick. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad was only 62. He'd just sent me photos from his weekend fishing trip to Lake Tahoe 3 days earlier, grinning beside a massive trout, looking healthier than he had in years. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, certain I'd misheard. What? When? Is he? The funeral is Saturday at 2 p.m., Riverside Memorial Chapel. I thought you should know. Should know. Not should come. Now we need you here. Should know. Like I was a distant acquaintance being informed out of courtesy. Patricia, I'll be on the first flight out. I can help with arrangements, flowers, whatever. That won't be necessary. Everything's handled. The line went quiet, except for the sound of my own breathing. I could hear muffled voices in the background. My half-siblings Derek and Madison, probably. They'd never warmed to me either, treating me like an unwelcome reminder of their father's first marriage. I'll see you Saturday, I managed. Another pause. Then, actually, Jasmine, I think it's best if you don't come. The words didn't compute at first. I sat up in bed, fully awake now. I'm sorry, what? This is a difficult time for our family. Your presence would only complicate things. Make it harder for everyone to grieve properly. Our family. Not the family. Our family. Like I wasn't part of it. Like the 32 years I'd been David Mitchell's daughter had somehow been erased the moment he married her. Patricia, he's my father. I have every right. You moved across the country, Jasmine. You made your choice. You barely called, rarely, visited. Don't pretend this is about grief when it's really about guilt. Each word was calculated, precise. She'd rehearsed this conversation. That realization stung worse than the accusations themselves. I moved to Seattle for my job. Dad understood that. We talked every week, and I visited whenever I could afford. The decision is made. I'm sorry for your loss. She hung up. I sat there in the darkness of my studio apartment, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. Outside my window, Seattle was sleeping, oblivious to the fact that my world had just imploded. My father was dead, and his wife had just banned me from saying goodbye. The relationship between Patricia and me had been strained from the beginning, but this level of cruelty was beyond anything I'd imagined. When Dad married her 5 years, after my mother's death from cancer, I'd tried to be supportive. I was 24 then, fresh out of college, struggling to establish myself in the tech industry while still processing my own grief. Patricia had 2 teenagers from her previous marriage, and Dad seemed so happy to have a full house again. I told myself it was natural that I'd feel displaced, natural that holidays felt different, that conversations grew shorter, that I gradually became more of a visitor than a daughter in the house where I'd grown up. But this felt like warfare. Spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, alternating between fury and devastation. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I booked a red-eye flight to Sacramento, my childhood home. If Patricia thought she could erase me from my father's funeral, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. The flight felt endless. Every minute dragged as I wrestled with memories of my father. David Mitchell had been a quiet man, a civil engineer who built bridges for the county. He wasn't demonstrative with his love, but it was steady, reliable. He'd taught me to drive in his old Ford pickup, helped me with calculus homework at the kitchen table, walked me down the aisle at my college graduation when my mother was too sick to attend, After Mom died, we'd grown closer. He'd call me every Sunday morning, usually while Patricia was at church with Derek and Madison. Those conversations were our sacred time, just the two of us talking about work, weather, whatever was on our minds. He'd been so proud when I landed, my job at a Seattle tech startup, even though it meant I'd be 2 states away. "You go chase those dreams, sweetheart," he'd said. "I'll be right here when you need me." Except now he wasn't anywhere. I landed in Sacramento at noon on Friday, giving me 24 hours before the funeral. I'd grown up in this city, knew every street and shortcut, but driving through downtown felt surreal. Everything looked smaller, older, like I was seeing it through the wrong end of a telescope. I checked into a hotel near the chapel, then drove to my father's house. The house where I'd lived until I was 18, where I'd had birthday parties and Christmas mornings and teenage heartbreaks. The house that was now Patricia's domain. 3 cars sat in the driveway: Patricia's white Lexus, Derek's black Mustang, and Madison's silver Honda. All of them home, all of them preparing for tomorrow. All of them inside the house where I was, no longer welcome. I parked across the street and sat there for nearly an hour, watching shadows move behind the familiar windows. Once, Derek came outside to check the mail. He was 25 now, tall and broad-shouldered like our father. He glanced in my direction, and for a moment I thought he might see me, might wave, might remember that we'd once built snow forts together in that same front yard. Instead, he went back inside without a second look. That evening, I drove to Riverside, Memorial Chapel, to see if I could speak with someone about the arrangements. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Chen, was sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, but Mrs. Mitchell was very clear about the guest list. She's the legal next of kin, and these decisions fall to her." "But I'm his daughter, his biological daughter. I understand, and I'm truly sorry for your loss. But legally, the surviving spouse has the authority to make these decisions." I left the funeral home feeling more isolated than I'd ever felt in my life. My father was lying in a casket 20 feet away, and I wasn't allowed to see him. Wasn't allowed to say goodbye. I wasn't allowed to grieve with the people who should have been my family. That night, I called my cousin Brian, my father's nephew who lived about an hour away in Stockton. Brian was one of the few relatives who'd stayed in touch after Dad remarried. Jasmine. "Oh, honey, I heard about Uncle David. I'm so sorry. How are you holding up?" "Brian, are you going to the funeral tomorrow?" "Of course." Patricia called me with the details. "Wait, you are going to be there, right?" I took a shaky breath. She told me not to come, said my presence would complicate things. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "What? Jasmine, that's insane. You're his daughter. You have to be there." "Tell that to Patricia." "I will. This is completely out of line." What kind of person bans someone's child from their funeral? Hearing Brian's outrage helped validate what I was feeling. I wasn't being dramatic or oversensitive. This was genuinely cruel, genuinely wrong. "Will you do me a favor?" I asked. "Will you record the service? I know that sounds morbid, but I need to hear what people say about him. I need some kind of closure." "Of course. And Jasmine, you should come anyway. What's she going to do? Have you been arrested?" I'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing Brian say it out loud made it real. Yes, I was going to go anyway. Patricia could try to stop me, but she couldn't erase 32 years of being David Mitchell's daughter. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Northern California winter weather. I dressed carefully in the black dress I'd bought for my college graduation, the one Dad had complimented. I spent extra time on my makeup, knowing that I'd probably cry and wanting to look composed for as long as possible. At 1:30 p.m., I drove to Riverside Memorial Chapel. The parking lot was nearly full, which surprised me. Dad had been well-liked in the community, but I hadn't expected such a turnout. I recognized several cars belonging to his coworkers from the county engineering department, neighbors from our old street, even some of my high school friends' parents. I walked through the chapel doors with my head high, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. The chapel was beautiful, with stained glass windows casting colored light across wooden pews filled with people. At the front, surrounded by elaborate flower arrangements, sat a closed casket with my father's photograph beside it. The photo showed him from last Christmas, smiling in his favorite red flannel shirt. Seeing his face made my chest tighten, but I forced myself to keep walking. That's when I spotted Patricia near the front row, dressed in an elegant black suit, accepting condolences from a line of visitors. Derek and Madison flanked her, looking appropriately somber. When Patricia's eyes found mine across the crowded chapel, her face went rigid. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful. If you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. She excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked straight toward me, her heels clicking against the polished floor like gunshots. I told you not to come. Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut glass. A few nearby conversations, quieted as people sensed tension. And I told you he's my father, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I have every right to be here. You have no rights here. This is a private service for family and close friends. I am family. Not anymore. The words hung in the air between us like a thrown gauntlet. Around us, I could feel people watching, listening, trying to understand what was happening. These were people who'd known me since childhood, who remembered me as David Mitchell's little girl. Mrs. Henderson, our old next-door neighbor, appeared at my elbow. Jasmine, sweetheart, I'm so sorry about your father. He was such a good man. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she couldn't very well cause a scene in front of Dad's longtime neighbor. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. He really was. You look just like him, you know. Same eyes, same smile. Before Patricia could respond, Mr. Chen approached us. Mrs. Mitchell, we're ready to begin. Patricia shot me one last warning look, then returned to her seat. I found a spot in the back, grateful that I'd made it inside before she could escalate things further. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. Person after person stood up to share memories of my father. His colleagues talked about his integrity and work ethic. Neighbors remembered his willingness to help with everything from broken lawnmowers to snow removal. Old friends shared stories about his terrible golf game and his legendary barbecue skills, but sitting there, listening to people celebrate my father's life, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Not one speaker mentioned me. Not one. Story included his daughter Jasmine. It was as if I'd been systematically erased from every anecdote, every memory. When Derek stood up to give the family eulogy, he talked about growing up with the best stepfather a guy could ask for, about Dad teaching him to fish and helping him with his college applications. Madison followed with her own speech about how grateful she was that David had become her father when she was just 13. They painted a picture of a man who'd been a devoted husband and father to his blended family. But somehow, in their version of his life, I didn't exist. I sat in that back pew, surrounded by people who'd known me for decades, and felt myself disappearing in real time. This wasn't just about being unwelcome at a funeral. This was about being erased from my father's legacy entirely. As the service concluded and people began filing out, offering final condolences to Patricia and her children, I remained in my seat. I needed a moment to process what had just happened, to understand the full scope of this betrayal. That's when I noticed the small group of people gathering near the back exit. Brian was there, along with a few of Dad's co-workers and some family, friends. They were looking in my direction with expressions of confusion and concern. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been Dad's secretary for 15 years, broke away from the group and walked over to me. Jasmine, honey, what in the world is going on? Why weren't you sitting with the family? I looked into her kind, worried face and realized that not everyone was part of Patricia's rewriting of history. Some people remembered exactly who I was and where I belonged. "It's complicated, Mrs. Patterson." "No, it's not," said a voice behind me. I turned to see Mr. Franklin, Dad's longtime friend and fishing buddy. "It's wrong, is what it is. David would be furious if he knew what was happening." Here, other people were nodding, murmuring agreement. These were people who'd known my father for decades, who'd watched him raise me as a single parent after Mom died. They could see exactly what Patricia was trying to do, and they didn't like it. That's when Patricia appeared, Derek trailing behind. Her. "I think it's time for you to leave," she said, her voice carrying across the small group. The murmuring stopped. Everyone turned to stare at us. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. "This is David's daughter. She has every right to be here." "She has no rights here," Patricia repeated, louder this time. "This is a private gathering for people who were actually part of David's life." The words were like a slap across the face of everyone who'd known us both. You could feel the shift in the room, the moment when shock turned to outrage. Mr. Franklin's face darkened. "Patricia, I think you need to be very careful about what you say next." But Patricia was beyond careful. She was in full attack mode, and she'd clearly been waiting for this moment. "David's real family is grieving right now. We don't need someone who couldn't be bothered to visit more than twice a year showing up to play the devastated daughter." The accusation was so unfair, so deliberately cruel, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. But before I could respond, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone. "Twice a year?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Patricia, I scheduled David's calendar for 15 years. Jasmine called him every single Sunday. She flew down here every Christmas, every Easter, his birthday, and at least 3 other times a year. She sent him care packages when he had the flu, cards for every holiday, photos from her life in Seattle." She was scrolling through something on her phone as she spoke. "And since you want to talk about who was part of David's life, let me share something interesting. Every year for the past 5 years, David asked me to help him update his will. Every year, he made sure everything was exactly the way he wanted it. And every year, he told me the same thing. Make sure my Jasmine is taken care of. She's the best thing I ever did." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face had gone white. Derek was staring at Mrs. Patterson like she'd just revealed state secrets. "He updated his will?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "Just 3 months ago. Right after your last visit, actually. He said you two had such a good time at the Giants game that it reminded him how important family really was." I remembered that visit. Dad had surprised me with tickets to see his favorite baseball team play. We'd spent the whole day together, just the 2 of us, eating hot dogs and arguing about which players were worth their salaries. It had been one of the best days we'd had in years. Patricia looked like she was going to be sick. "What will?" "We already met with the lawyer. Everything goes to me and the kids." Mrs. Patterson's smile was sharp as a blade. "You met with a lawyer about the will David made 8 years ago, right after you got married. But that's not his most recent will. Mr. Hoffman has been trying to reach you all week about the reading. It's scheduled for Monday morning." The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. Dad had updated his will 3 months ago, and Patricia had no idea, which meant she'd been acting under false assumptions this entire time. "Monday morning," I managed. 10 a.m. at Hoffman, Burke and Associates. David was very specific about who needed to be there. Mrs. Patterson looked directly at Patricia. "The whole family." Patricia turned and walked away without another word, Derek hurrying after her. Madison lingered for a moment, looking confused and maybe a little scared, before following her mother and brother. I stood there in the emptying chapel, surrounded by people who'd known and loved my father, and felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt since that awful phone call 3 days ago. Hope. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my hotel room with my laptop open, a yellow legal pad beside me, and my phone charging on the nightstand. Mrs. Patterson's revelation about the updated will had changed everything, but I wasn't naive enough to think this would be simple. Patricia had spent 8 years positioning herself as the grieving widow and devoted family matriarch. She wouldn't go down without a fight. The smart thing to do was prepare for war. I started with what I knew. Dad had updated his will 3 months ago, right after my last visit. The reading was scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m. with Hoffman, Burke, and Associates. Patricia and her children had no idea this new will existed. These were facts, but facts meant nothing without context, without proof, without a strategy. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Just got home. That was insane. Are you okay?" Instead of responding immediately, I called him. Brian had been at the funeral, had witnessed Patricia's performance, had seen how she'd tried to erase me from Dad's legacy. He was my ally, but more importantly, he was a witness. "Brian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. What's going on?" "Over the past few years, when you saw Dad at family gatherings, did he ever mention feeling conflicted about his relationship with Patricia? About how things were going at home?" There was a long pause. "Jasmine, why are you asking?" "Because I'm starting to realize that what happened today wasn't spontaneous. Patricia has been planning this for a while, maybe even before Dad died. I need to understand what was really going on in that house." Brian sighed heavily. "I didn't want to say anything while he was alive, but yeah. The last couple times I saw Uncle David, he seemed different, quieter, like he was walking on eggshells in his own home. Tell me everything." "Last Thanksgiving, I got to their house early to help with setup. Patricia was in the kitchen giving Derek instructions about seating arrangements. She said something about making sure certain people didn't dominate the conversation and ruin the holiday for the real family. When I asked what she meant, she got all flustered and said she was just stressed about hosting. My pen froze over the notepad. She said, "Real family?" "Yeah." And Derek just nodded like this was normal conversation, like they'd talked about this before. I wrote it down, along with the date and Brian's name as witness. "What else?" "At Christmas, Uncle David pulled me aside when we were watching the game. He asked if I thought he'd been a good father to you. I told him of course he had, but he seemed genuinely worried about it. He said Patricia kept telling him that you were pulling away, that you didn't need him anymore now that you had your fancy job in Seattle." Each detail felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Patricia hadn't just banned me from the funeral on impulse. She'd been systematically poisoning my relationship with my father for years, creating a narrative where I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned the family. "Brian, I need you to write all of this down. Dates, exact quotes, everything you can remember. And I need you to think about other family members who might have witnessed similar things." "Why? What are you planning?" "I'm going to that reading on Monday, and I have a feeling Patricia is going to try to claim that Dad was mentally incompetent when he updated it, or that someone influenced him, or that the will is fake. I need to be ready to prove that he was making clear, rational decisions based on what was really happening in his life." After I hung up with Brian, I started making a list of everyone who'd been at the funeral, everyone who'd witnessed Patricia's behavior. Mrs. Patterson was the obvious star witness. She'd worked with Dad for 15 years and had direct knowledge of his will updates. But there were others. Mr. Franklin, Dad's fishing buddy, had looked genuinely shocked by Patricia's cruelty. Mrs. Henderson from next door had known our family since I was 8 years old. There was Tommy Rodriguez from Dad's engineering team, who'd always remembered my birthday because Dad would mention it at work. These weren't just random people. These were individuals who'd had ongoing relationships with my father, who'd seen the real David Mitchell, not Patricia's carefully curated version. I opened my laptop and started researching Hoffman, Burke and Associates. The law firm had been in Sacramento for 40 years, with a solid reputation for estate planning and family law. Marcus Hoffman, the senior partner, had been practicing for 35 years. This wasn't some fly-by-night operation that Patricia could intimidate or manipulate. Next, I pulled up my phone records. Patricia had accused me of barely staying in touch with Dad, of only visiting twice a year. My phone company's website let me download detailed call logs going back 2 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Calls to Dad's number every Sunday, lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. Additional calls on his birthday, Father's Day, holidays, and random weekdays when something reminded me of him. I downloaded and printed everything, then organized it by month. The pattern was clear and consistent. Far from being the absent daughter Patricia described, I'd been in regular, frequent contact with my father right up until his death. Then I remembered something that made my heart race. Dad had been teaching himself to use email about a year ago, determined to get with the times, as he put it. We'd exchanged dozens of messages, everything from articles he'd found interesting to photos from his fishing trips, to random thoughts about politics and sports. I logged into my email account and started searching for his address. The results made me gasp. 47 emails from Dad over the past 8 months. 47 pieces of evidence that we'd maintained a close, loving relationship despite the distance. I read through each one, printing the most significant messages. There was the email where he'd told me how proud he was of my promotion at work. The one where he'd shared a photo of himself reading a book I'd recommended. The message where he'd mentioned feeling grateful every day for the daughter who calls just to check on her old man. But it was the email from 2 weeks before he died that stopped me cold. Jasmine, I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, about what we leave behind and how we're remembered. I want you to know that you're the best thing I ever accomplished. Everything else, the houses, the job, even the second marriage, it's all just background noise. You're the melody, sweetheart. You're the song that makes my life worth singing. Love, Dad. I stared at the screen through tears, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of clarity. My father had known exactly how he felt about me, and he'd put it in writing. Patricia could spin whatever narrative she wanted, but she couldn't argue with his own words. The email was dated February 3rd. According to Mrs. Patterson, Dad had updated his will in January, just 1 month earlier. The timing wasn't coincidental. I spent the next several hours documenting everything I could think of. My bank records show wire transfers to help with Dad's medical bills when he'd had kidney stones last year. Receipts from gifts I'd sent for Christmas, his birthday, Father's Day, screenshots from social media posts where he'd proudly shared news about my job achievements. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Patricia herself. While scrolling through my old text messages, I found a conversation from 6 months ago. Dad had been in the hospital for routine surgery, and I'd been trying to coordinate my visit. Patricia had been the point of contact, and our text exchange was illuminating. Patricia. David's surgery went fine. He's resting. Me. Thank God. What time are visiting hours? I can be there by tonight. Patricia. That's not necessary. He's on pain medication and won't be very talkative. Me. Patricia. He's my father. I want to be there. Patricia. He specifically said he didn't want visitors today. Maybe wait until tomorrow. Me. He said that? That doesn't sound like him. Patricia. You know how he is when he's not feeling well. Very private. I'd waited until the next day, and when I arrived, Dad had been confused about why I hadn't come sooner. He'd been asking for me since he woke up from surgery. Patricia had lied to keep me away, even when my father was specifically asking for me. The pattern was becoming clear. This hadn't started with the funeral. Patricia had been systematically interfering with my relationship with Dad for months, maybe years. The funeral ban was just the culmination of a longer campaign to erase me from his life. Around 3 a.m., I got a text from an unknown number. "This is Madison. Can we talk?" Madison was Patricia's daughter, my 20-year-old stepsister. We'd never been close, but we'd never been hostile either. She was just a kid when our parents got married, and I'd been dealing with my own grief and adjustment. I called the number. Madison answered on the first ring. "Jasmine? I'm sorry to text so late. I couldn't sleep." "What's going on, Madison?" "I need to tell you something about today. About the funeral. My mom. She told Derek and me that you didn't want to be involved, that you'd said it would be too painful and you'd rather grieve privately." My hand tightened on the phone. "Madison, that's not what happened." "I know. I heard her on the phone with you. I was in the kitchen when she called Tuesday morning. I heard her tell you not to come. This was huge. Madison was Patricia's own daughter, and she was willing to contradict her mother's story. Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's not right. David loved you. He talked about you all the time. He was always showing people pictures from your visits, bragging about your job, telling stories about when you were little. And at the funeral today, when Derek gave his speech and didn't mention you at all, I saw people looking around, confused. They knew something was wrong." Madison's voice cracked a little. "I loved David too. He was the only real father I ever had. But what my mom did today, erasing you like that, it would have broken his heart." "Madison, would you be willing to write down what you just told me? About hearing the phone call? About how Dad talked about me?" "Yes. And Jasmine? There's something else. After Mrs. Patterson said that thing about the will, my mom went crazy. She was on the phone for hours last night, calling lawyers, trying to figure out what was going on. She keeps saying there must be a mistake, that David wouldn't have changed anything without telling her." After Madison hung up, I sat in the pre-dawn darkness of my hotel room, surrounded by papers and evidence, and the growing realization that Monday's will reading was going to be much more than a simple legal formality. Patricia had spent years constructing a narrative where she was the devoted wife and I was the neglectful daughter. She'd used that narrative to justify excluding me from Dad's final moments, from his funeral, from his memory. But narratives only work when everyone agrees to believe them. And I had proof that her story was a lie. I opened my laptop and started typing. Not an emotional rant or an angry letter, but a calm, detailed timeline of events. Every conversation, every text message, every email, every witness who could verify the truth about my relationship with my father. If Patricia wanted to fight over Dad's legacy, I was ready. But this wouldn't be a shouting match or a family drama. This would be about facts, evidence, and the truth. Because my father had raised me to believe that truth always wins in the end, even when the process is messy and painful. By sunrise on Sunday morning, I had compiled 43 pages of documentation. Phone records, emails, text messages, bank statements, witness statements, and a detailed timeline of Patricia's behavior over the past several years. I wasn't just preparing for a will reading anymore. I was preparing to defend my father's memory against someone who'd spent years trying to rewrite his story. Monday couldn't come fast enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp winter sunshine that made Sacramento look deceptively cheerful. I'd been awake since 5 a.m., going over my documentation one final time, but I felt more prepared than nervous. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. The offices of Hoffman, Burke, and Associates occupied the third floor of a stately brick building downtown, the kind of place that radiated old money respectability. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the same black dress from the funeral, but with a navy blazer that made me look more like a lawyer than a mourner. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, smiled when I gave my name. "Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Hoffman is expecting you. You're the first to arrive. I took a seat in the waiting area, a folder of documents on my lap, and tried to calm my racing heart. Through the tall windows, I could see the parking garage where Patricia would soon arrive, probably expecting a routine reading of the will she thought she knew by heart. At exactly 9:55, the elevator doors opened and Patricia stepped out, followed by Derek and Madison. Patricia wore a somber gray suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to inherit everything. Derek looked uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit, while Madison hung back, avoiding eye contact with everyone. When Patricia saw me sitting there, her face went through a fascinating series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold. "Mask of control. What is she doing here?" she asked the receptionist as if I couldn't hear her. "Mrs. Mitchell, everyone named in Mr. Mitchell's instructions is required to attend," the receptionist replied smoothly. "Mr. Hoffman will explain everything shortly." Before Patricia could respond, Marcus Hoffman himself appeared, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd handled thousands of family disputes. "Good morning, everyone. Please come into the conference room." We filed into a wood-paneled room dominated by a long mahogany table. Hoffman took his place at the head, with Patricia and her children on one side, me on the other. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. "I want to address the elephant in the room immediately," Hoffman began, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand there was some confusion about which we'd be reading today." Patricia's jaw tightened. "Confusion? I have no idea what you're talking about. David and I updated our wills 8 years ago, right after we got married. Everything was settled." Hoffman opened a thick folder. That will was indeed valid at the time. However, Mr. Mitchell contacted me in December to make significant changes. The document we're reading today supersedes all previous versions. The color drained from Patricia's face. "That's impossible. David would have told me." According to my notes, Mr. Mitchell was quite specific about the confidential nature of these changes. He wanted to ensure they reflected his true wishes without external pressure or influence. Derek leaned forward. "External pressure from who?" Hoffman's eyes shifted briefly to Patricia, then back to his papers. "Let's proceed with the reading, shall we?" What followed was 15 minutes that changed everything. The will started conventionally enough. Dad had left specific bequests to various charities, a vintage coin collection to Brian, his fishing gear to Mr. Franklin. But then came the major provisions. To Patricia, the house, her car, and a lump sum of $150,000, enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. To Derek and Madison, $50,000 each for education and getting started in life. And then Hoffman paused, looking directly at me. "To my beloved daughter, Jasmine Mitchell, who has never stopped being the light of my life despite the challenges we've faced as a family, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all investment accounts, retirement funds, life insurance, policies, and my share of Mitchell Engineering Consulting. This includes approximately $800,000 in liquid assets and a business valued at $1.2 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face had gone from pale to ashen. Derek was staring at Hoffman like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Only Madison looked unsurprised, confirming my suspicion that she'd known this was coming. Furthermore, Hoffman continued. Mr. Mitchell included a personal letter to be read aloud. He wrote, "I know this will come as a shock to some, but it shouldn't. Jasmine has been my rock through every difficult moment of my life. When her mother was dying, she helped me hold our family together. When I was struggling to adjust to being a widower, she checked on me every day. When I married Patricia, she welcomed my new family with grace, even though it meant sharing her father with strangers." Patricia's hands were shaking now. "This is ridiculous. David was sick, confused. Someone manipulated him. I want to be clear," Hoffman continued reading. That this decision has nothing to do with not loving Derek and Madison. They are good kids who deserve every opportunity, but they have their mother to provide for them, and their biological father contributes to their support. Jasmine has only me, and I have only her. She is my blood, my heart, my legacy. Stop, Patricia whispered, but Hoffman kept reading. If anyone questions this decision, they should know that I made it with a clear mind and full heart. I've watched Patricia systematically try to erase Jasmine from our family for years. The canceled holiday visits, the forgotten birthdays, the constant comments about how Jasmine has moved on and doesn't need us anymore. I stayed quiet because I thought it would get better, but it only got worse. The room felt like it was shrinking. Patricia was crying now, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage and humiliation. The final straw was when Patricia told me that Jasmine said she was too busy to visit for Christmas. I called Jasmine that same day and discovered she'd never said any such thing. In fact, she'd already bought plane tickets and was planning to surprise me. Patricia had lied to both of us to keep us apart during the holidays. Derek turned to stare at his mother. "Mom, you said Jasmine canceled Christmas." I realized then that Patricia sees Jasmine as a threat to her inheritance, not as my daughter. This will is my way of making sure that the person who has loved me unconditionally for 32 years is protected and provided for. Jasmine, I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to stand up for you while I was alive. I hope this makes up for some of that. Hoffman closed the folder. The will is legally binding and was witnessed by 2 independent parties. Mr. Mitchell was given a full mental competency evaluation as a precaution, which he passed with flying colors. Patricia exploded. "This is a fraud. Someone forged this. Probably her." She pointed an accusing finger at me. "She manipulated a sick old man. Mrs. Mitchell?" Hoffman's voice cut through her hysteria like a blade. "I understand you're upset, but I won't tolerate accusations of fraud or elder abuse. Your husband was thoroughly evaluated by Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatric psychiatrist, before any changes were made. He was found to be completely mentally competent. I want a copy of that evaluation," Derek demanded. "You're welcome to contest the will in court, but I should warn you that Mr. Mitchell anticipated that possibility. He left very detailed documentation of his reasoning, including specific examples of what he called systematic exclusion of his daughter." Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over. I'll fight this with everything I have." "That's your right," Hoffman replied calmly. "But I should mention one more thing. Mr. Mitchell was very concerned about the potential for family conflict after his death. He included a clause stating that anyone who contests the will without valid grounds forfeits their inheritance entirely. The money would then go to charity. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Patricia could fight the will, but if she lost, she'd lose everything. After Patricia and her children left, Derek and Madison looking shell-shocked, Patricia muttering about lawyers and fraud, Hoffman turned to me. "Your father was a good man, who loved you very much. He came here 6 times over 3 months, making sure every detail was perfect. He said he wanted to make sure you knew how much you meant to him." I managed to thank him through my tears, then walked outside into the bright Sacramento morning, my head spinning with the magnitude of what had just happened. That's when I saw Mrs. Henderson from our old neighborhood getting out of her car across the street. She waved and walked over. "Jasmine! How did the reading go, dear?" Without thinking, I told her everything. The updated will, the inheritance, Patricia's reaction, the letter Dad had written. Mrs. Henderson listened with growing amazement and indignation. "That woman tried to steal your inheritance?" she said, loudly enough for several passers-by to hear. "After everything she put you through?" That's when I noticed one of those passers-by was holding up a phone, clearly recording. In my emotional state, I'd been talking loudly, and Mrs. Henderson's outraged responses were even louder. "Ma'am!" The young woman with the phone approached us. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you saying your stepmother banned you from your father's funeral and then tried to steal your inheritance? I should have walked away, should have said no comment, should have protected my privacy. Instead, I looked into this stranger's concerned face and said, "Yes, that's exactly what happened." The young woman's name was Jessica Torres, and she was a journalism student at Sacramento State. She'd been walking to her internship at the local news station when she heard Mrs. Henderson's outburst. What started as casual curiosity turned into an impromptu interview right there on the sidewalk. "Can you tell me more about what happened at the funeral?" Jessica asked, her phone still recording. And I did. I told her about Patricia's call, about being banned from saying goodbye to my father, about how I'd been erased from every speech and memory shared at the service. Mrs. Henderson chimed in with her own observations about Patricia's behavior over the years. "This is incredible," Jessica said when I finished. "Would you be willing to do a longer interview? This is exactly the kind of story people need to hear." I gave her my contact information, then drove back to my hotel, emotionally drained but oddly exhilarated. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I had some control over the narrative. That afternoon, Jessica called. She'd pitched the story to her supervising editor at KMAX TV, and they wanted to do a full segment for the evening news. Not just about the will, but about the broader issue of family manipulation and financial abuse of inheritance rights. "The station thinks this could be a really important story," Jessica explained. "We've gotten calls from other people who say similar things happened to them. You could be giving a voice to a lot of people who've been silenced." I agreed to the interview, which aired that Thursday evening. It was a 6-minute segment titled "Banned from the Goodbye: When Grief Becomes Greed." Jessica had done her homework, interviewing legal experts about inheritance rights and family law attorneys about the prevalence of such disputes. But she'd also tracked down several people who'd been at Dad's funeral, including Mr. Franklin and Mrs. Patterson. Their testimonies about Patricia's behavior and Dad's true feelings about me were devastating. The story concluded with me reading excerpts from Dad's letter, including the line about Patricia systematically erasing me from the family. Within hours of the broadcast, the story was picked up by other local stations. By Friday morning, it was trending on social media with the hashtag #CharkFuneralBanned. The key, Sacramento Bee, ran a follow-up story. Then came the calls from national media. What really made it explode was a TikTok video Jessica posted, condensing the story into 90 seconds with captions like, "POV, your stepmother bans you from your dad's funeral and plot twist. He left you everything anyway." The video got 2.4 million views in 24 hours. By Saturday, exactly 1 week after Dad's funeral, I was getting calls from producers at CNN, Good Morning America, and Dr. Phil. Patricia had gone completely silent, but Derek and Madison were getting bombarded with requests for comment. The story had touched a nerve. Thousands of people shared their own experiences of being excluded by step-parents, manipulated during family crises, or cut out of inheritances they'd expected. I'd become the face of a phenomenon that was apparently much more common than anyone realized. Sunday morning, I got a text from Madison. "My mom is furious. She blames you for ruining our family's reputation. But honestly, I'm glad people know the truth." That same morning, Patricia finally broke her silence with a Facebook post that only made things worse. "I'm devastated by the lies being spread about our family during this difficult time. David was confused in his final months and influenced by people who took advantage of his grief and illness. We're exploring all legal options to protect his true wishes and our family's privacy." The post was shared thousands of times, but not in the way Patricia intended. The comments were brutal. "Your stepdaughter has receipts and you have excuses. Imagine banning someone from their father's funeral and then calling them the problem. Ma'am, he wrote you a whole letter explaining why he changed his will. That's not confusion, that's clarity." Patricia deleted the post within 6 hours, but screenshots had already gone viral. I sat in my hotel room, watching my phone buzz with interview requests and social media notifications, and realized that something extraordinary had happened. What started as a personal family tragedy had become a national conversation about grief, greed, and the families we choose versus the families we're born into. And for the first time since that awful phone call a week ago, I felt like my father's voice was finally being heard. The first major consequence came on Tuesday morning, exactly 8 days after the viral TikTok exploded. I was in my hotel room, fielding calls from reporters and trying to decide which national interviews to accept when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Mitchell? This is Robert Chen from Pacific Northwest Bank in Seattle. I'm calling about your father's business accounts." My father's engineering consulting firm had been his pride and joy, built from scratch over 25 years. According to the will, I now owned 70% of it, with the remaining 30% belonging to his business partner, Frank Caruso. "Mr. Chen, what can I do for you?" "Well, we've been trying to reach Mrs. Patricia Mitchell about some irregularities in the business accounts. Large withdrawals over the past 6 months that don't match the usual operating patterns. Since you're now the majority owner, we thought you should be aware." My blood ran cold. "What kind of withdrawals?" $50,000 in October, $30,000 in December, and another $40,000 just last week, all signed by Mrs. Mitchell, who was listed as an authorized signatory. I grabbed a pen. "She was authorized to access business accounts?" "Yes, your father added her about 2 years ago. But these recent withdrawals, they're concerned, especially the timing of the last one. The last withdrawal had been made 3 days before Dad's death, 3 days before Patricia knew she'd need to lawyer up to contest the will. Mr. Chen, I need copies of all account activity for the past year. Everything. Of course, I'll email them within the hour." After hanging up, I immediately called Frank Caruso. Frank had been Dad's business partner and closest friend for over a decade. If anyone would know about these mysterious withdrawals, it would be him. "Jasmine, honey, I'm so sorry about your father. And what that woman did to you at the funeral. David would have been furious. Frank, I need to ask you about the business accounts. Did you know Patricia was making large withdrawals?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Frank? Jasmine, I tried to call your father about those withdrawals. Multiple times. Patricia kept telling me he was too busy to talk, that she was handling the finances now. I thought it was strange, but what? The last time I tried to reach him, about 3 weeks before he died, Patricia told me he'd specifically said not to bother him with business questions anymore. She said he was stepping back, letting her handle more responsibilities. Another lie, another manipulation. Dad would never have stopped taking Frank's calls. They talked business at least twice a week. "Frank, I'm sending you the bank records. I think Patricia's been stealing from the company." The bank records arrived an hour later, and they painted a devastating picture. Over the past year, Patricia had systematically drained $180,000 from the business accounts. But it wasn't random. Each withdrawal corresponded to specific events. The first major withdrawal, in March, happened right after I'd visited for Dad's birthday. He'd seemed so happy that weekend, talking about expanding the business and maybe bringing me in as a consultant eventually. 2 weeks later, Patricia had withdrawn $25,000. The October withdrawal coincided with Dad mentioning in one of our Sunday calls that he was thinking about updating his will to make sure everyone's taken care of properly. The December withdrawal happened the week after he'd actually changed the will. And that final $40,000? Withdrawn on the same day Dad had his heart attack, before she'd even called to tell me he was dead. Patricia hadn't just been planning to contest the will, she'd been systematically looting the business to fund her legal challenge and secure her financial future. I called Marcus Hoffman immediately. "Mr. Hoffman, I think we have a bigger problem than just a will contest." When I explained about the withdrawals, Hoffman's tone shifted from polite professionalism to sharp legal focus. Ms. Mitchell, if what you're describing is accurate, Mrs. Mitchell may have committed embezzlement and fraud. The timing of these withdrawals, especially the final one, suggests premeditation. What do we do? First, we document everything. Then we consider whether to involve law enforcement. But Jasmine, you should know, this changes everything about any potential contest. If Patricia has been stealing from the estate, she's forfeited any moral or legal standing to challenge your father's final wishes. While I was dealing with the financial revelations, the media attention was creating its own set of consequences for Patricia. The viral story had reached far beyond social media into her real-world community, and the fallout was swift and merciless. Madison called me that afternoon, her voice shaky. Jasmine, I need to tell you what's happening here. It's getting really bad. What do you mean? Mom's book club kicked her out. The ladies at her gym won't talk to her. Someone spray-painted fraud on our garage door last night. I felt a pang of sympathy, despite everything. Madison, I never wanted— No, you don't understand. I'm not calling because I feel sorry for her. I'm calling because she's getting desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. Madison's voice dropped to a whisper. She hired this lawyer, someone she found online who specializes in aggressive estate litigation. He charges $800 an hour, and he's already asking for a $50,000 retainer. Where is she getting that kind of money? That's what I'm trying to tell you. She's been selling stuff. Dad's coin collection, his tools, even some of the furniture. And Derek found out she took out a loan against the house. This was spiraling beyond anything I'd imagined. Patricia wasn't just contesting the will, she was betting everything on overturning it, burning through assets that legally belonged to the estate. Madison, you need to document what she's selling. Take pictures. Keep receipts if you can find them. She's not supposed to be disposing of estate assets while there's a pending legal challenge. There's more. Her lawyer wants to have you investigated. He thinks if he can prove you manipulated Dad somehow, or that you knew about the will, changes and influenced them, he can get the whole thing thrown out. I almost laughed. Good luck with that. I have 47 emails from Dad, 2 years of phone records, and multiple witnesses who can testify about our relationship. That's not what I'm worried about, Madison said. I'm worried about what else they might do. This lawyer, Mr. Hendricks, keeps talking about playing hardball and fighting fire with fire. Mom's paying him way too much money to just file normal legal papers. That evening, I found out what Madison meant. I was having dinner at a quiet restaurant near my hotel when a man approached my table. Mid-40s, expensive suit, predatory smile. Ms. Mitchell? Nathan Hendricks, attorney for Patricia Mitchell. I represent the true beneficiaries of your father's estate. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Other diners were looking in our direction, some with their phones out. Mr. Hendricks, if you want to speak with me, you can contact my attorney. Oh, I think we can handle this more informally. See, I've been doing some research into your relationship with your father. Very interesting patterns. He sat down uninvited, pulling out a manila folder. Did you know that your father's mental health deteriorated significantly in his final months? His neighbors reported seeing him confused, disoriented. His doctor prescribed anxiety medication. And you, conveniently, were the only family member he was in regular contact with during this vulnerable period. Every word was calculated, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He was trying to create a public spectacle, to plant seeds of doubt about my character and Dad's mental state. Mr. Hendricks, you're creating a disturbance. I'm going to ask you to leave. I'm just sharing some information that might interest you. For instance, did you know that elderly people who've suffered recent losses are particularly susceptible to manipulation by family members who promise love and attention in exchange for financial benefits? That's when I realized what he was doing. This wasn't a legal strategy. This was a smear campaign. He was trying to publicly humiliate me, to create doubt about my motives, to turn the narrative against me. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He was doing it in a restaurant full of people with phones, including someone who recognized me from the viral videos. I pulled out my own phone and started recording. "Mr. Hendricks, for the record, are you alleging that I manipulated my father into changing his will?" His confident smile faltered slightly. "I'm simply noting that the timing of your increased contact with your father correlates suspiciously with his will changes. And are you basing this on any actual evidence, or are you just trying to intimidate me in a public restaurant?" Ms. Mitchell, when someone stands to inherit nearly $2 million, actually, it's closer to $2.3 million now that I've discovered your client embezzled over $180,000 from my father's business accounts. Would you like to comment on that? The color drained from his face. "I have no knowledge of any—" "Of course you don't. Just like you have no knowledge of the fact that your client lied to keep me away from my father's deathbed, or that she banned me from his funeral, or that she's been systematically stealing from his estate while paying you $800 an hour to harass his actual beneficiary." By now, the entire restaurant was watching. Several people were recording. Hendricks stood up quickly, his composure completely shattered. "This conversation is over." "Yes, it is. And so is your client's credibility." After he left, I posted the video to TikTok with the caption, "When your stepmother's lawyer tries to intimidate you in public but forgets you have receipts for her embezzlement." The video got 800,000 views in 2 hours. But Hendricks wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to a certified letter delivered to my hotel. It was a formal demand that I submit to a psychological evaluation to determine my mental fitness and capacity to inherit, along with allegations that I had unduly influenced my father through systematic manipulation and isolation tactics. The letter was also sent to every major media outlet that had covered my story. Hendricks was trying to flip the script, to make me the villain. But he'd underestimated how thoroughly I'd documented everything, and how many people had witnessed Patricia's behavior firsthand. I called Marcus Hoffman, who was furious when I read him the letter. "This is desperate and unethical. Hendricks is throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. But Jasmine, he's also making his client's position worse with every move." "How so?" "Because now we have grounds for sanctions, harassment, bad faith litigation, public defamation. And if Patricia really has been embezzling from the business, this aggressive strategy just draws more attention to her criminal exposure." That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hiding from Hendricks's smear campaign, I was going to lean into it. I called Jessica Torres, the journalism student who'd broken the original story. "Jessica, how would you like to do a follow-up investigation? Because I think Patricia's financial crimes are much bigger than anyone realizes." We spent the next 3 days going through every document I'd collected. Bank records, business transactions, property records, even Patricia's social media posts from the past year showing expensive purchases that didn't match her declared income. What we found was staggering. Beyond the business account theft, Patricia had been forging Dad's signature on documents, accessing his retirement accounts, and even trying to change beneficiaries on his life insurance policies. The total theft was close to $300,000, money that should have gone to Derek, Madison, and me according to Dad's original will, and money that definitely belonged to the estate under his final will. Jessica's follow-up story, titled "The Inheritance Theft: How a Stepmother's Greed Exposed a Web of Financial Fraud," aired on a Thursday evening and immediately went national. By Friday morning, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office announced they were opening a criminal investigation into Patricia's financial activities. And by Saturday, exactly 2 weeks after the viral story first broke, Derek and Madison Mitchell issued a joint statement through their own attorney, formally disavowing their mother's legal challenge and requesting that she cease using their names in any litigation. The statement concluded, "We believe our stepfather David Mitchell was of sound mind when he made his final will, and we support his daughter Jasmine as the rightful heir to his estate. Our mother's actions do not represent our values or wishes. Patricia was now completely alone, facing criminal charges, bankruptcy from legal fees, and the complete collapse of her carefully constructed image as the grieving widow. But the consequences were just beginning. The power dynamic shifted completely. On a rainy Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the district attorney announced their investigation, I was back in Seattle, trying to return to some semblance of normal life, when Marcus Hoffman called with news that changed everything. Jasmine, Patricia's attorney, just filed a motion to withdraw from her case. I nearly dropped my coffee. What does that mean? It means Hendricks is abandoning ship. When lawyers withdraw this abruptly from a high-profile case, it's usually because their client can't pay them anymore, or because they've discovered something that makes the case legally or ethically impossible to continue. Which do you think it is? Probably both. The DA's investigation has uncovered some very damaging evidence. Patricia's not just facing civil liability anymore. She's looking at potential felony charges for elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. No legitimate attorney wants to be associated with that. But the real bombshell came 2 hours later when Madison called, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Jasmine, you have to help us. Mom's lost her mind. She's trying to sell the house." What? She can't sell the house, it's part of the estate dispute. That's what Derek told her. But she says the legal bills are too high and she needs money for a new lawyer. She's already signed a listing agreement with a realtor. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Madison, where are you right now?" "At Derek's apartment. We both moved out yesterday. Mom's been acting so strange, staying up all night making phone calls, talking to herself, writing things down and then tearing them up. We're scared of what she might do." That afternoon, I booked another flight to Sacramento. But this time, I wasn't coming as the grieving daughter begging for acceptance. I was coming as the legal owner of nearly everything Patricia thought belonged to her. The house looked different when I arrived Friday evening. The manicured lawn Dad had been so proud of was overgrown. Patricia's white Lexus sat in the driveway with a realtor's lockbox attached to the front door. A for sale sign dominated the front yard. I parked across the street and called the realtor whose name was on the sign. "Hi, this is Jasmine Mitchell. I'm calling about the property you have listed on Maple Street." "Oh yes, the Mitchell property. Are you interested in scheduling a showing?" "Actually, I'm calling to inform you that the property is part of a contested estate and cannot legally be sold while litigation is pending. If Mrs. Patricia Mitchell didn't disclose this to you, she's committed fraud." The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Ma'am, Mrs. Mitchell said she was the sole owner. She provided documentation." "Forged documentation. I'm the legal heir to the estate, and I'm ordering you to remove that listing immediately. If you proceed with any sale, you'll be participating in the illegal disposal of estate assets." As the sun began to set, I placed one more yellow rose on his grave and drove away, leaving the past where it belonged and focusing on the future I was going to build. The confrontation was over. The real work was just beginning. 3 days after my confrontation with Patricia at Dad's grave, she signed the plea agreement. The news came through Marcus Hoffman on a Wednesday morning while I was back in Seattle, trying to focus on my regular job for the first time in a month. "She's agreed to everything," Hoffman said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "Full restitution, public admission of guilt, withdrawal of the will contest. The DA is recommending 3 years probation with community service instead of prison time." I should have felt victorious, but instead I felt empty. The legal battle was over, but what was I supposed to do with the rest of my life? I was now worth over $2 million, owned a successful engineering firm, and had become accidentally famous for being the woman who stood up to family greed. But I was also completely alone in a way I'd never been before. That evening, I sat in my small Seattle apartment, surrounded by sympathy cards and media interview requests, and realized I had no idea what came next. For a month, my entire existence had revolved around fighting for Dad's legacy and my place in his story. Now that the fight was over, I felt unmoored. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was someone named Maria Santos, and the subject line read, "Your story saved my family." The message read, "Dear Jasmine, I saw your interviews about being banned from your father's funeral. The same thing happened to me when my mother died last year. My stepfather told me the service was family only and I wasn't welcome. I was too devastated to fight back, and I've regretted it every day since. But watching you stand up for yourself gave me the courage to contest my mother's will. I just wanted to thank you for showing me that it's never too late to fight for what's right." I stared at the screen, reading Maria's words over and over. This was the first time I'd really understood that my very public family drama had affected other people's lives in meaningful ways. Over the next few days, similar messages arrived. Dozens of them. People who'd been excluded from funerals, cut off from inheritances, manipulated by step-parents or estranged relatives. Each story was different, but the theme was consistent. My willingness to fight publicly had given others permission to stand up for themselves. On Friday, Jessica Torres called with an idea that would change the direction of my life completely. "Jasmine, I've been following up on your story, and I keep hearing from people who've been through similar experiences. Have you considered starting some kind of support organization? Maybe a foundation?" "I've thought about it, but I wouldn't know where to begin. What if we organized a meeting, just to see how many people are dealing with these issues? I could help promote it through my contacts at the station." A week later, I found myself standing in front of 43 people in a community center conference room in downtown Sacramento. They ranged in age from 25 to 70, representing every demographic you could imagine. But they all shared one thing. They'd been excluded, manipulated, or abused by family members during times of grief. The stories I heard that night were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. There was Robert, a 60-year-old teacher, whose siblings had refused to tell him about their mother's death until after the funeral, claiming they didn't want drama at the service. Angela, a 35-year-old nurse whose stepmother had sold all of her deceased father's belongings before she could retrieve her childhood mementos, then claimed the father never mentioned wanting Angela to have anything. Michael, a 40-year-old veteran whose estranged wife had had him removed from their son's funeral by security guards, claiming he was too unstable to grieve properly. Each story followed a similar pattern. Vulnerable people being taken advantage of during their most painful moments by family members who prioritized money, control, or revenge over basic human decency. "The problem," said Linda, a retired social worker who'd been excluded from her husband's funeral by his adult children from his first marriage, "is that there's no real legal protection for situations like these. Funeral arrangements, estate, decisions, even access to medical information. It all goes to whoever has the legal standing, not necessarily the people who deserve it. But there's also an emotional component," added James, a therapist whose own brother had tried to have him declared mentally incompetent to steal his inheritance. "When you're grieving, you're not thinking clearly. You're vulnerable to manipulation, and the people who should be supporting you are often the ones taking advantage." As I listened to story after story, I realized that my experience with Patricia wasn't unusual, it was epidemic. Families were being torn apart by greed and power struggles, often at the exact moments when people needed support most. "What if we did something about it?" I finally said. "Not just support each other, but actually work to change the system?" The room went quiet. Everyone was staring at me. "What do you mean?" Angela asked. "I mean advocacy, education, legal reform. What if we used our experiences to help other people avoid going through what we went through?" Over the next 3 hours, we outlined the framework for what would become the David Mitchell Foundation for Family Justice. Named after my father, the organization would focus on three main areas. First, direct support for people experiencing family manipulation during times of grief. This would include legal referrals, counseling resources, and emergency financial assistance for people fighting wrongful exclusion from inheritances or funeral arrangements. Second, public education about the warning signs of family financial abuse and the legal protections available to potential victims. Third, legislative advocacy to strengthen laws protecting vulnerable family members during estate disputes and medical crises. The goal, I explained to the group, isn't to break up families or encourage lawsuits. It's to make sure that grief isn't weaponized, that love isn't conditional on financial gain, and that everyone has the right to say goodbye to the people they care about. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People started volunteering their time, their expertise, their networks. Linda offered to develop support group protocols. James volunteered to create educational materials about emotional manipulation. Robert wanted to work on legislative research. Within 2 weeks, we had a board of directors, a mission statement, and enough initial funding from my inheritance to rent office space and hire our first staff member. The Foundation's first major initiative was something we called the Final Goodbye Project, a campaign to strengthen laws around funeral access rights. Working with sympathetic legislators, we drafted model legislation requiring that funeral homes verify the legal authority of anyone claiming to exclude family members from services. Too many funeral directors just go along with whoever seems to be in charge, explained Senator Claire Rodriguez, who agreed to sponsor our first bill. They don't want to get involved in family disputes, so they default to whoever's paying the bills. But that's not always the person with the moral or legal right to make decisions. Our second initiative was more personal, a traveling workshop series called Protecting Your Legacy, Protecting Your Family. I found myself speaking at community centers, senior centers, and legal aid organizations across California, sharing my story and teaching people how to identify and prevent family financial abuse. The workshops were emotionally draining but incredibly rewarding. At each event, I met people who were either currently experiencing family manipulation or were terrified of it happening to them. Many were elderly people whose adult children were already showing signs of financial predatory behavior. Others were middle-aged people trying to figure out how to protect their own kids from potentially manipulative step-relatives. The key, I would tell each audience, is documentation and communication. Don't assume your family understands your wishes. Don't assume they'll do the right thing when you're not around to enforce it. And don't let anyone convince you that talking about death and money is morbid or inappropriate. These conversations save families. 6 months after the foundation launched, we'd helped over 200 people navigate family disputes, provided legal referrals to 89 families fighting inheritance theft, and successfully lobbied for funeral access legislation in 3 states. But the most meaningful moment came when Derek reached out to me directly. I was in my new office, a bright, open space in downtown Sacramento that I'd chosen specifically because it felt nothing like the cold perfection of Patricia's house. When Derek walked in without an appointment, he looked older, more serious than the awkward 25-year-old I'd last seen at Dad's funeral. He was wearing a work shirt with Mitchell Engineering embroidered on the pocket. "I hope it's okay that I just showed up," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "Of course I want to see you. You're my brother." He smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since we were kids. "I've been working at the firm with Frank Caruso, learning the business. Frank says Dad always hoped one of us would take over someday." "Dad would be so proud," I said, and meant it. "How's the transition going?" "Good. Really good. Frank's a great teacher, and the work is exactly what I hoped it would be. But that's not why I'm here." Derek sat down across from my desk, his expression growing serious. "I need to apologize. For the funeral, for not standing up to Mom sooner, For letting you go through all of this alone. I was a coward. Derek, you were in an impossible situation. No, I wasn't. I was 25 years old, not 15. I knew what Mom was doing was wrong, but I was scared of losing my inheritance, scared of being cut off from the family money. So I stayed quiet and let her destroy you. His honesty was both painful and healing. What changed? I asked. Madison, actually. She never stopped talking about how wrong the whole thing was. And then, when all the financial stuff came out, when we realized Mom had been stealing from Dad's business, I couldn't pretend anymore that she was just a grieving widow making hard decisions. Derek reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila envelope. This is for you. I found it on Dad's desk when Frank and I were going through his office files. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter addressed to me in Dad's familiar script. The postmark was dated just 2 weeks before his death. My hand shook as I opened it. My dearest Jasmine, it began. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me and you're probably dealing with more family drama than anyone should have to handle. I want you to know that whatever Patricia or anyone else tells you, you are the light of my life and the best thing I ever accomplished. You are strong enough to handle whatever comes next, and I believe you'll use that strength to help other people who are going through what you're going through. That's who you are, sweetheart. You see pain in the world, and you fix it. I love you always, Dad. I cried reading it, but they were good tears. Healing tears. He wrote that right after he changed his will, Derek said quietly. Frank found it sealed in an envelope marked for Jasmine, after. I think he knew Mom would try to cause problems. Why didn't you give this to me sooner? Because I was ashamed. Because I knew it would make me realize how badly I'd screwed up, how much I'd hurt you by choosing Mom's side. Derek looked around my office, taking in the mission statement on the wall, the photos of foundation events, the stacks of case files representing families we'd helped. But I'm glad I waited, because now I can see what you've built. Dad would be so proud of this place, of everything you're doing. That afternoon, Derek and I had lunch together for the first time since we were teenagers. We talked about Dad, about the business, about our complicated feelings toward Patricia. We didn't solve everything. There were still hurt feelings and trust issues to work through. But it was a beginning. I'd like to help with the foundation, Derek said as we were finishing our meal. Not financially. I know you don't need that. But maybe I could volunteer or help with the engineering aspects of your building projects. I'd love that, I said. But Derek, you don't have to do this to make up for what happened. I've forgiven you. I know. But I want to do it anyway. Because this work matters. And because I want to be part of something Dad would be proud of. 6 months later, the David Mitchell Foundation had grown from a single office to a regional organization with satellite locations in 4 states. We'd helped over 500 families, successfully lobbied for protective legislation in 7 states, and developed educational programs that were being used by elder law attorneys across the country. But more importantly, I'd found my purpose. The pain of being excluded from Dad's funeral had been transformed into a mission to make sure no one else had to experience that kind of betrayal during their most vulnerable moments. I was no longer just David Mitchell's daughter who'd been banned from his funeral. I was Jasmine Mitchell, advocate for family justice and protector of the vulnerable. And Dad's legacy wasn't just the money he'd left me. It was the work I was doing in his honor, the families I was helping, and the changes we were making to prevent other people from experiencing the cruelty I'd survived. Building something new from the wreckage of my family had been painful, but it was also the most meaningful work I'd ever done, and it was just the beginning. 2 years after that devastating phone call that changed my life forever, I stood in the ballroom of the Sacramento Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 800 people who had gathered for the David Mitchell Foundation's 2nd annual Family Justice Summit. The transformation from that first meeting of 43 people in a community center conference room felt surreal. The summit had drawn families, legal professionals, therapists, and legislators from across the country. But more importantly, it had brought together people who understood what it meant to be abandoned by those who should have protected them during their darkest hours. As I waited backstage to deliver the keynote address, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. I was no longer the tech worker from Seattle who got devastating news in the middle of the night. I wasn't even just the woman who'd been banned from her father's funeral and fought back publicly. I had become something I'd never expected: a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for family justice, and the leader of a movement that was changing laws and saving families across the nation. 5 minutes, Ms. Mitchell, the event coordinator whispered. I took a deep breath and thought about Dad. He would have been amazed by what had grown from the seeds of his final letter. What started as his attempt to protect me had blossomed into something that was protecting thousands of others. When I walked onto the stage, the standing ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. These weren't just polite conference attendees. These were people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work, families we'd helped reunite, individuals we'd supported through their own battles with inheritance theft and funeral exclusion. When my stepmother banned me from my father's funeral 2 years ago, I began, I thought my world was ending. I felt invisible, erased, forgotten. But what I've learned since then is that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing you'll ever do. I looked out at the audience and saw faces I recognized. Maria Santos, whose email had sparked my first understanding of the broader implications of my story, now served on our board of directors. Robert, the teacher who'd been excluded from his mother's funeral, had become our legislative liaison. Angela, the nurse whose stepmother had sold her father's belongings, now ran our victim advocacy program. But there were also faces I didn't recognize. Hundreds of people who were attending their first Foundation event, probably feeling the same mixture of pain and hope that had brought me to that first community center meeting. The David Mitchell Foundation has helped over 2,000 families in the past 2 years, I continued. We've successfully lobbied for protective legislation in 15 states. We've trained over 500 legal professionals on identifying and combating family financial abuse. But those numbers don't tell the real story. I clicked to the first slide in my presentation, a photo of the Hendersons, an elderly couple from Nevada. The real story is people like Frank and Dorothy Henderson. When Frank was diagnosed with dementia, his son from his first marriage convinced him to sign documents cutting Dorothy out of his will entirely. Dorothy had been Frank's wife for 30 years, but suddenly she wasn't allowed to visit him in the care facility, wasn't informed about his medical treatment, and was told she'd have to vacate their home immediately after his death. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Our foundation's legal team helped Dorothy challenge the fraudulent documents. We proved that Frank had been manipulated during a period of cognitive vulnerability. Not only did we restore Dorothy's rightful inheritance, but Frank's son is now facing elder abuse charges. Dorothy and Frank are back together, and their story has helped us strengthen elder protection laws in 6 states. I clicked to the next slide, a photo of 3 young adults standing together smiling. This is the Morrison family. When their father died in a car accident, their stepmother claimed that grief had made the children unstable and barred them from the funeral. She then forged documents claiming their father wanted to leave everything to her church. Our foundation helped these siblings prove the forgery, recover their inheritance, and, most importantly, hold a proper memorial service where they could finally say goodbye to their father. Story after story, case after case, I shared examples of families we'd helped heal, laws we'd changed, and systems we'd improved. But as I spoke, I realized the most important transformation wasn't in our external accomplishments. It was in the people themselves. The Foundation's work has taught me something crucial, I said, approaching the end of my prepared remarks. Family isn't just about biology or marriage certificates. Real family consists of the people who show up when you need them most, who fight for you when you can't fight for yourself, and who celebrate your victories as if they were their own. I gestured to the audience. Everyone in this room understands that. Whether you're here because you've experienced family betrayal yourself, or because you're a professional who helps families navigate these challenges, or because you're a legislator working to strengthen protective laws, you're all part of our family now. You're all part of Dad's legacy. As I concluded my speech and the applause died down, I was approached by a young woman I didn't recognize. She looked to be in her early 20s with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was working up courage to say something difficult. Ms. Mitchell? My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a law student at UC Davis, and I wanted to thank you for what you've done. Thank you for being here, Sarah. Are you interested in family law? Actually, I'm here because of my grandmother. She died last year, and my uncle tried to claim she'd left everything to him. My mom was too grief-stricken to fight it, but I remembered seeing your story on the news. I called your foundation's helpline. My heart clenched. What happened? Your legal team helped us prove that my uncle had been pressuring my grandmother to change her will while she was on pain medication after her hip surgery. We not only got back what my mom was supposed to inherit, but my uncle is now facing charges for elder financial abuse. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But the most important thing was that your advocates helped my mom realize she wasn't crazy, that what my uncle did really was wrong. She'd been beating herself up, thinking she was being greedy for questioning his claims. I'm so glad we could help. How is your mom doing now? She's amazing. She's actually volunteering with a local elder advocacy group, helping other families who are going through what we went through. She says helping others helps her heal. This was the pattern I'd seen over and over again. People who came to us as victims left as advocates. Pain transformed into purpose. Grief became a catalyst for protecting others. After the formal event ended, I found myself in the hotel bar with Derek, Madison, and about 20 other foundation team members. It had become a tradition. After every major event, we'd decompress together, sharing stories and planning for the future. I still can't believe how big this has gotten, Madison said, scrolling through social media posts from summit attendees. 2 years ago, you were just trying to get justice for yourself. Now you're changing laws and saving families all over the country. Derek nodded. Dad would be blown away. He always said you had the biggest heart of anyone he knew, but I don't think even he could have imagined this. The conversation turned to our upcoming initiatives. We were launching a national certification program for family law attorneys, ensuring they received specialized training in identifying and combating inheritance manipulation. We were also partnering with medical schools to educate future doctors about the warning signs of family financial abuse in healthcare settings. But the project I was most excited about was deeply personal. We were creating a scholarship program for young people who'd been cut off from family financial support due to manipulation or abuse. The scholarships would be funded entirely by recovered assets from successful inheritance theft cases, essentially using the greed of manipulative family members to fund the education of their victims. It's poetic justice, Derek had said when we first discussed the idea. Taking money that was stolen through family manipulation and using it to empower the next generation to break these cycles. As the evening wound down and people began heading back to their rooms, I stepped outside onto the hotel's terrace. Sacramento stretched out below me, the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there was the cemetery where Dad was buried, the house where Patricia had tried to erase me, the law office where everything had changed. But I wasn't thinking about the past anymore. I was thinking about the future. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. We'd maintained minimal contact since she'd completed her probation, but she sent occasional updates about her life. Tonight's message was longer than usual. Jasmine, I watched your speech online tonight. I know I have no right to be proud of you after what I did, but I am. You turned the worst thing I ever did to you into something beautiful. You're a better person than I ever was. I hope someday I can be half as graceful as you've been. Thank you for showing mercy when I deserved none. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Patricia, grace isn't about what people deserve. It's about what we choose to give. You're still Derek and Madison's mother, and they love you. Focus on being the person they need you to be going forward, she replied immediately. I'm trying, every day. The next morning, I had coffee with Jessica Torres, who had continued following the Foundation's work and was now a full-time investigative journalist with a major network. She was working on a documentary about family financial abuse, using my story as the central narrative thread. I've been thinking about how to end the documentary, she said, stirring her latte. What would you say to someone who's going through what you went through 2 years ago? Someone who just got banned from a funeral or discovered they've been cut out of a will? I considered the question carefully. I'd tell them that the people who try to erase you from the story don't get to write the ending. You do. The pain you're feeling right now, that's not the end of your story. It's the beginning of your power. That's beautiful. Can I use that? Of course. But I'd also tell them something practical. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And don't let anyone convince you that standing up for yourself makes you the villain. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to let them destroy each other. That afternoon, I drove to Dad's grave for the first time since my confrontation with Patricia 2 years earlier. The yellow roses I'd left then had long since been replaced by a small garden that Derek maintained. He'd planted Dad's favorite, flowers, marigolds and sunflowers, and installed a small bench where visitors could sit and reflect. I sat on that bench and told Dad about the summit, about the families we'd helped, about the laws we'd changed. I told him about Derek's work at the engineering firm, about Madison starting her master's degree in social work, about Patricia's slow journey toward becoming a better person. I think you'd be proud of what we've built, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but not caring. Not just the foundation, but the family we've become. It looks different than what you probably imagined, but it's real. As I prepared to leave, a car pulled into the cemetery. An elderly man got out, moving slowly with the help of a walker. He approached Dad's gravesite hesitantly. "Excuse me?" he said. "Are you Jasmine Mitchell?" "Yes, I am." "My name is Harold Stein. My daughter heard you speak yesterday and told me I should come talk to you. She said you might be able to help me." Harold's story was heartbreakingly familiar. His son had been manipulating him financially for months, claiming that Harold's deceased wife had wanted everything to go to blood family only, which excluded Harold's stepdaughter, who had been more of a caretaker than his biological son ever was. "I don't want to cause family drama," Harold said, his voice shaking. "But what my son is doing isn't right. Sarah, my stepdaughter, she's the one who stayed with me when I had my heart attack. She's the one who visits every week, who makes sure I take my medications. But according to the will my son is claiming exists, she gets nothing." I gave Harold our foundation's contact information and assured him that we'd have someone reach out within 24 hours. As he drove away, I realized that Dad's legacy wasn't just living on in the foundation. It was growing, expanding, touching lives he'd never know about. Driving back to Sacramento from the cemetery, I thought about the question Jessica had asked me. What would I tell someone going through what I'd experienced? The truth was, I wouldn't change what happened to me, as painful as it had been. Being banned from Dad's funeral had forced me to discover a strength I didn't know I possessed. Fighting. Patricia's lies had taught me that truth really does win in the end, even when the process is messy and public. Building the foundation had shown me that the worst experiences in our lives can become the source of our greatest contributions to the world. But most importantly, Dad's final gift, that letter explaining why he'd changed his will, had given me something more valuable than money. It had given me absolute certainty that I was loved that I mattered, and that my presence in his life had been a source of joy rather than burden. That certainty had become the foundation for everything else. My work, my healing, my ability to forgive Patricia, my relationships with Derek and Madison, and my capacity to help other families find their way through similar darkness. 6 months later, I stood in the Rose Garden of the California State Capitol as Governor Martinez signed the Family Protection Act into law. The legislation, which our foundation had spent 2 years developing and advocating for, created comprehensive protections against inheritance manipulation and funeral exclusion. This law will ensure that grief can't be weaponized, the governor said as cameras flashed. That family love can't be held hostage by greed or manipulation, and that every person has the right to say goodbye to their loved ones with dignity. As I watched the governor sign the bill that would protect thousands of future families from experiencing what I'd experienced, I felt Dad's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside me. We'd done it. We'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to me and transformed it into lasting change that would protect people for generations to come. And somehow, I knew that this was exactly what Dad had hoped for when he wrote that final letter. When he changed his will. When he made the difficult decision to prioritize truth over family peace. He'd given me the tools to build something beautiful from something broken. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.